This is an overview of the midterm study guide. So let me make this just a little bit bigger, hopefully, make it a little bit easier to read. This up, and then I can maybe get to this a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so here we are. 4 questions, one from each of the chapters that you've covered so far in the first couple weeks. So let's get started with the first one. And each question is worth 75 points. You will have 80 minutes to answer the 2 questions. These will be randomly assigned to you, so it makes sense to then prepare for all of them because you don't know which 2 you'll be assigned randomly. Okay, so maybe make that clear. I see there's a typo there. This question is worth 75 points, not 35. Sorry about that. Okay, so explain in detail. Question 1. Explain in detail how the 3 perspectives, the functionalist, the conflict, and symbolic interactions, analyze culture, and make sure to give examples to support your discussion. So, from a functionalist perspective, you want to think about how does culture serve a purpose? How is it beneficial? And of course, for functionalist theorists, they would argue that culture enables us all to live by the same norms, same values. We all then believe in the same laws, and so most people follow these norms and these laws. We believe in the same values, and that enables society to be stable. It enables society to keep moving forward because we're all operating um, from the same rule book, if you will, kind of like a team, right? Playing same rule book, working with the same set of beliefs. We move forward. And you can give examples about how that is. If we're all pretty much following the laws and the norms, then you can see how easily this makes society less chaotic. Just take a simple example such as traffic lights. Traffic lights, there's red and green and yellow. Well, we know red means stop and green means go and yellow means punch it, you'll make it. Think about it this way. What if some people, when, in the morning wake up and think, today red's going to mean go and yellow's going to mean stop and green's going to mean caution. And somebody else decides that the colors mean something different. Then you can see how we'd have a lot of accidents, not just on the roads, but too, because some people, on freeways when there's a lot of traffic, there are the lights that tell us when we can go, how many cars can go, which there's going to be a lot of chaos. And just think about laws and how most of us we don't steal, most of us. But if a lot of people stole, then think again about how chaotic it would be if everybody was stealing from one another from stores. We would maybe not feel safe going. So from a conflict perspective, you're going to want to think about how culture sometimes um, is created in such a way by the people who have the power. The norms and values are created so that people who have the power are benefited by these norms, by these rules, and even by the laws, and those who don't have the power, don't have the resources and the money, are disadvantaged by these. So just think about something as taken for granted as paying fines. And you get a traffic ticket, you're supposed to pay the fine. Well, if you're a wealthy person or a middle class person, paying the fine, maybe you don't like doing it, but you can pay the fine. What about if you're somebody who is low income or you're poor and you can't? So then, because you haven't paid the fine, the ticket just fine keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then there's a bench warrant out for your arrest. And then one day you're driving to work and you get pulled over because your tires are a little bald or because your taillight's not working. And because of that bench warrant, you get taken to jail. On your way to school to take a final or a midterm, you are on your way to work. Now maybe fine when you can't, you don't have the money to often people with money who create these norms and values and laws are advantaged and others are disadvantaged. And chapter 3, I want you to also consider, the just the way that there's this acceptance of middle class values and norms, and perhaps a belief that the norms and values of people who are poor or working class are inferior to those that are middle class. And then for a symbolic interactionist perspective, you should be thinking about how does culture shape the way that we interact with one another. And there's a good discussion in the text about symbols and gestures, and how we communicate, certainly through language, but also we use symbols and gestures, facial expressions, to communicate as well. And that sometimes, depending upon what someone says or does, it doesn't necessarily coincide with what their actions are. So just consider this. Sometimes, I'm sure we've all had this experience. You ask somebody if they're okay or what's wrong, and they say, "Oh, yeah, I'm fine," or "Nothing's wrong." You can tell by the look on their faces that there is something wrong, or that everything is not fine. Okay? Or when someone smiles at us, sometimes it's not a genuine smile. Sometimes it's more like a sneer, versus when there is a genuine smile, maybe by somebody who loves us, a favorite grandparent or a significant other. That's a different kind of smile. So also consider that. Then I ask you to explain ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, two different ideas. Ethnocentrism, of course, the idea that we, by our own cultural standards, we tend to think of our own culture as being better than others, and so we tend to think of the way other people do things from other cultures as substandard to ours or inferior. Cultural relativism, the idea that we try to understand why people from other cultural groups do things differently from us. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but we can just try to understand, so that we're not judging them solely based on our own ideas about what is good or bad, right or wrong, but we're trying to understand what they do through their own cultural standards. Why is it useful to us as sociologists? Well, of course, it's because it helps us to be objective. It helps us to try to remove the biases that we typically have, which is quite common. Ethnocentrism is very common. There's a tendency to view how our group does things as the better way. And so by trying to use cultural relativism, by reminding ourselves to use cultural relativism as sociologists, we hope that we're more objective and that we are less judgmental and less biased. How does technological change influence cultural change? And explain cultural imperialism, cultural diffusion, cultural leveling. Excuse me. Some water. Technological change, from everything from computers to even old school things like telephones and um, um, TVs and messaging apps and various types of social media. All of these things, they influence cultural change, and explain how. Maybe even think about how the way you uh, use technology is different from maybe the way your parents or your grandparents do. And then explain the cultural relativism, the cultural diffusion, and the cultural leveling. What are these things, and how does technology perhaps shape or speed some of these things up? In your opinion, which is the most prevalent of these three types of cultural influence, the imperialism, the diffusion, or the leveling? Think about where we are now in 2021, back in 2020. Sorry, we're in 2022. Oops. And what do we experience in the US today? Question 2 is from chapter 1. And here you're going to focus on those three perspectives once again. And you're going to focus on these three perspectives from a general perspective, meaning that focus on generally how functions view society, how functions view society as a set of interrelated parts and how these parts all fit together and enable society to be stable and to be able to progress. You also are going to want to discuss the advantages and the disadvantages or the critiques of functionalism. And make sure you give examples as well as you discuss what functionalist theorists, how they view society. Conflict theory, same thing, focusing on power, who has the power, how power is being used, focusing on the inequalities between those who have the power, the resources, and the wealth and those who don't. And again, giving examples of how conflict theorists see this playing out in society, and again, talking about the advantages and critiques. And this is explained and discussed fairly thoroughly in chapter 3, the advantages and critiques, as well as the theories. Symbolic interactionist perspective, again, focusing on how symbolic interactionist theorists, which is a micro perspective, how they focus on our interactions, our personal interactions with one another, and how within groups, depending upon our status within a particular group, our social interaction might change from when we are with friends versus when we're with family versus when we are at work versus when we're at class. Okay? And again, the advantages and the critiques of symbolic interactionism. Discuss sociological imagination. Remember the idea that we have to understand the fact that we don't develop in a vacuum, that we have a history, and we also have a biography, a story, a unique story that intersects with where we are in history, where we are at a particular time in society. And then there is an article in the text called Global Perspective. It's on page 22. Read the article. It discusses the Eurocentric perspective that is very much present in sociology, particularly a lot of the foundational theories that we have in sociology, and how that may be a problem. And I ask you to consider, is this Eurocentric perspective present in other areas of life as well? Is it present perhaps in education or in healthcare or in politics or wherever else you might perhaps see this Eurocentric perspective? And explain why you either think it is or it is not. Question number 3, I ask you to explain how the three perspectives, the functionalist, the conflict, and symbolic interactionists, analyze socialization, and functionalist perspective, what are the positive things, the beneficial things that we get from socialization, versus the conflict perspective, which is looking at what are perhaps some of the negative parts of socialization, versus the symbolic interactionist perspective, which is focused on how socialization influences the way that we interact with one another. And then primary group and secondary group in your life, a primary group in your life, a secondary group in your life, and then some positive things that you get from being in each group, and also some negative things that are potentially negative things